Huge show for you today with all the hot topics, all the important subjects. We're going to talk NFL rules with Fox Sports NFL and college football rules analyst Dean Blandino, former director of officiating for the National Football League. You watched him all weekend on Fox. He was a very busy man. So we're going to talk to him. We're going to get updates on what's going on with the Pittsburgh Steelers, with Paul Zeiss, columnist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and a radio host in Pittsburgh. Also, Chris Myers will join us to talk about the Vikings-Packers game. That was a big one. Looks like, everybody's kind of settling in for a dogfight in that division, it appears. The Packers and the Vikings and possibly the Bears. Big victory for them over the Broncos. Not possibly. They're going to be in there as well. So we're going to talk to Chris Myers about that. He was assigned to that game by Fox. Additionally, we'll talk to Eric Edholm, who is a guy you need to follow on Twitter. One of the best. He knows how to do Twitter. He's outstanding. And he is a football writer for Yahoo Sports, NFL draft expert. Eric Edholm will join us as well. So, my God, we got a full show. And we're covering everything, basically. This is kind of a pro football day. I may get into some college football, but tomorrow we're going to be focusing on college football on Tuesday, and we'll get to that later. And I do want to address some things, though, especially with Dean Blandino about what happened at the end of the Arizona State-Michigan State game, which was one of the most remarkable endings I've ever seen. But first, the breaking news is Antonio Brown. Big story came out. A takedown story of sorts from Robert Klemko of Sports Illustrated, SINow.com. Just came out a few minutes ago about Antonio Brown. No criminal complaints, no criminality that we're aware of, at least, that came out of that story. Some so-called sordid tales about his personal life, about him not paying debts, and he's been sued for not paying debts. Something that we already kind of knew about. Well, we actually knew about it before to a certain extent. But so we'll get deeper into that later on in the show as we talk to Eric Edholm and Paul Zeiss. But as far as Antonio Brown is concerned, when you look at this new article, folks, you're going to be hearing about this, Patriots fans. And I just want everybody to know he's going nowhere. All the stuff that's in here, there's a new revelation about him walking around nude with his genitals, I guess, were covered by a wash rag. This woman who was an artist had come up. He had brought her up from New York City, I guess, to paint a mural of him. And, we hear all about what an awful experience it was for her, and I'm sure it was. But if it's not a criminal complaint, the Patriots aren't going to care. They're not going to do anything. And it's much ado. Now, what this really represents, this new article by Robert Klemko, is he's suddenly a media superstar. I would imagine in the Boston media market in New England, people are going to be very excited about that. They're going to be excited about it in Pittsburgh. They might be excited about it in the Bay Area and on ESPN, FS1. This is something to talk about, all right? It's Phil, but it's nothing more than that. And we saw an example, and I fell victim to it last week when I said Antonio Brown's not going to play. Remember when I went crazy about that? I was dead flat wrong because I kind of bought into the media hype. So before we talk more about that, though, we want to bring in Dean Blandino, who was everywhere over the weekend. If you were watching Fox, you could not escape him. He was everywhere. He is the former director of officiating with the National Football League. And, of course, now Fox Sports rules analyst for the NFL, college football. He's got the Good Calls podcast for iHeartRadio that he just launched. And, Dean, I can't believe you're awake.
I'm awake. I got a busy Monday, but I'm excited. I've been a fan for a long time, and I'm excited to talk a little football officiating with you.
Absolutely. First of all, tell us about what you're doing with Fox Sports for people who don't know. And how do they not know? But just give us a quick primer on what your duties are.
Yeah, so what I do is I'm in the studio on Saturdays and Sundays for college football and NFL, and we're there. We're monitoring all of our games, and we have a line to the TV truck, so I can talk directly to the producer. Anything officiating related, rules, replay, and then if there is something significant, I can go on the air and explain what's happening to the viewers. And I think that's where we really provide some value, because sometimes, especially with football, these rules are pretty complicated, and we try to just make it easier for everyone to understand.
Now, this has always been in the back of my mind, and I'll guarantee you there are people who are watching, this has been in the back of their mind. But as a former NFL director of officiating, when you talk about guys like you and the announcers, are you guys in the ears of what's going on down, maybe not on the field, but when it comes to being in the booth and perhaps back in New York with the National Football League? This is during the game.
The league implemented in 2014 the ability for designated members of the officiating department to be involved in replay decisions. So there's wireless communication. All of the officials have an earpiece and a microphone, and they can communicate with each other. They can communicate to the replay booth, and they can communicate with the people in New York. And so starting with 2014, we were involved in those replay decisions. Now, you're not in the side judge's ear in the middle of a play and saying throw the flag or don't throw the flag, but you are involved in those replay decisions and in some instances administrative things like resetting the clock or a penalty enforcement. So those are things that you can get involved in from New York or from the replay booth.
One thing that I think was really underrated over the weekend, and I don't think gets enough play, and I've heard talk about it, was the CBS broadcast that involved the Jags and the Texans and the lack of replay angles for Leonard Fournette because it was a D-level, F-level game. Is that what's really going on? Because they don't have enough cameras at a lower level game. You don't get as good a look, and that may have cost, of course, Leonard Fournette and the Jags possibly that win.
Yeah, it's something that when we brought replay back in 1999, we discussed that, because there are different levels of games. And Sunday night, NBC, you're going to have a camera package that is much larger than a game in an early window on Sunday. And so the competition committee, what they basically landed on is like, look, both teams in that game are playing under the same guidelines. They have the same number of cameras. And if we don't get a look, we don't get a look. And that was a great example of not having a definitive camera angle, where maybe had that game been on Sunday night or Monday night, maybe they would have had a better camera angle. It's just one of those things, but the competition committee feels that both teams are playing under the same parameters in that game.
Visiting with Dean Blandino, former NFL director of officiating, now the rules analyst for Fox Sports for NFL and college football. And as much as we bring it up, I think the eyes glaze over when we talk about the new rule is in terms of pass interference, what makes it reviewable, what are the circumstances? And it's clear to me that just a lot of people aren't aware of what the difference is. We saw it play out with the Vikings and Packers. It blindsided, though, a lot of people. Can you just explain in a thumbnail what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, this stems from last year, the NFC Championship game, and there was an obvious missed call, and the league felt compelled to implement this rule. And now this is the first time in replay where we're really dealing with subjective calls. Pass interference is very subjective. It's contact before the ball arrives, but does that contact hinder the receiver's ability to make a play on the ball? Well, that's judgment. It's not an objective like the ball touching the ground or the foot touching the sideline. And I think that play was a great example of the subjectivity. I didn't think it was enough for a foul. Obviously, they created it. They made it a foul in replay. And there's going to be differences of opinion when you come to these judgment calls. And I think that's where we are today with this rule. But I am concerned, but it's a one-year rule. So if it doesn't pan out, the league doesn't have to vote it out. They can just leave it and move on and try to go in a different direction.
Do you think this is going to work?
I don't know. I mean, early returns are not. I don't think they are very good right now, and through no one's fault other than it's just a hard call to re-officiate and replay. Those plays happen in real time. Officials have to make decisions in real time, and now we're micromanaging it and using slow motion replay to administer something that happens, very quickly on the field. So I don't know. I'm not hopeful that it will.
Is there any system of officiating accountability beyond just the subjective opinion of the director of officiating? I mean, how does that work as to who is going to be assigned? And what we saw perhaps with the Rams and the Saints, everybody's screaming about that yesterday. Could that have any impact on that crew, in the near future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there is accountability, and there's several layers of accountability. Officials, look, there's very few professions where what you do is immediately critiqued by people like myself, fans, coaches. And then there's a layer of accountability at the league office where you have supervisors who are former officials that are evaluating each game, each play, each call, and they get a report. Each crew gets a report at the end of the week, where they point out mistakes, good things, and that accumulates throughout the season. So an official will get a postseason assignment based on those reports and those evaluations, and ultimately whether they're retained for the following season will basically, if they don't grade out very well, they can be let go. So there definitely is a level of accountability on the officials.
Let's move over to college football. Of course, the ACC last week released a statement that the officiating crew blew a call in the UNC Wake Forest game. I mean, what's your philosophy when it comes to public statements acknowledging mistakes by officials?
Yeah, I think it's a very delicate balance, because you want to have a sense of transparency, but you can't come out every week and just point out mistakes by the officials. There are going to be mistakes that are made. They're human beings. But if you continue to point out mistakes, then you kind of undermine the credibility of the officiating, of the officials on the field in your program. But when something does raise to that level where it's a game-ending play and North Carolina should have had another play, then I think most conferences will make a statement like that. I know the NFL, we would make statements like that, and that was a situation where they should have had one more play and they didn't, and the ACC obviously felt that it was significant enough to release a statement.
What were your thoughts on the way that Arizona State, Michigan State game played out? I mean, I can't remember seeing a sequence like that in my life. And then ultimately you end up with another penalty that should have been called, and it wasn't.
It's a crazy sequence. And you just, as a former supervisor of officials, you're trying, I look at it as, okay, how can we make sure this doesn't happen again? What happened? Where was the breakdown? Was it a mechanic? Was it communication? But you look at that sequence, Michigan State has 12 on the field for a potential game-tying field goal. I mean, that's a huge mistake, and replay catches it. So they're going to have to re-kick, and then we miss the leaping foul, which, look, that can happen. It happens quickly. But you hate to see a game. Michigan State didn't lose the game because of that one missed call, but you just hate to see a game end with questions about officiating versus, the two teams were ultimately decided the outcome of the game. So it was a crazy sequence, and you don't see that happen very often.
What's the big difference between college football and the NFL? The biggest difference when it comes to reviewable plays, and if there's something in there that you think is fixable or that could be improved on the college football side, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the biggest differences, I think from a procedural standpoint, are that replay in college, the replay official can stop the game at any time, whereas in the NFL, there's coaches' challenges during certain segments, and only the coach can challenge during those times. I like that college has replay for targeting. I think that's a big penalty, especially when you're talking about ejecting players from games. And so I like that is reviewable, and you have an opportunity to get it right in replay. And I think both systems work for the games. But I think there are some things that each game, system could work in the other. I like the idea of limiting the number of challenges. I think we put a big burden on replay officials in college. Every game they have to, be on top of it. So I like the idea of maybe limiting that and putting more burden on the coaches. And in the NFL, I would love to see, some of these players' safety fouls be reviewable versus truly subjective calls like pass interference.
One last question for you, and we talk about subjectivity, and it's kind of troubling to me. We saw it happen in the Vikings game, Stephon Diggs, and the celebration after the touchdown, and that has a profound impact on the game now. When it comes to a point after touchdown, you move it back, it's a 48-yard kick, or you turn it into a very difficult proposition on a 2-point conversion. That's a very, very subjective thing. And I really kind of object to giving the official, because it's personality to personality. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about the celebration thing, and to place that much import, connect it to the penalty?
It's such a big penalty, because when you look at the percentages from, the accuracy on a 33-yard kick compared to a 48-yard kick is significant. And that is something the league did kind of loosen their restrictions on celebrations 2 years ago, and allowed the players more expression and things like that. I think the one thing that is more black and white is you can't take your helmet off as part of the celebration.
Which he did. Yes.
And I think the official didn't have any choice in that. Diggs just celebrated and done his thing and then went to the bench area. That's one thing. But when you take your helmet off, that's where it becomes a foul.
So if they had not called that penalty, would that have been a big screw up then? They had to call it.
I think the Packers then would have had a legitimate complaint there, because when you take, it's in the rule book in black and white, when you take your helmet off to either confront an official or an opponent, or as part of a celebration on the field or in the end zone in that area, it is a foul.
Tell us about this new podcast called Good Calls on iHeartRadio. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's new. We just had our first episode last week. We're going to be talking about, every weekend.
Big week, man.
There's something to talk about. And so I said, hey, wait a minute. Why not just have, everybody has a podcast, right? So why not have a podcast where we can talk about this stuff? And so we're going to talk about college. We're going to talk about Saturday, Sunday, what happened, and have a little fun too, and talk about maybe, I'm a rules guy, so let's talk about maybe some life rules and some different situations that come up. And so, yeah, you can catch it on the iHeart app or iTunes or anywhere where you get your podcast. So I'm excited about it.
I really appreciate it, man. Hope to have you on again. And you're doing a great job, man.
Thanks, Brooks.
That's Dean Blandino on Fox Sports. He is a college football NFL rules analyst. Sorry about that, Jeff. I'll get to your comments. That's on me. I got to get the app up and running, for crying out loud, during the show. It's on me. We're going to get to some of your comments and some of your questions while we have guests. There's no reason why we can't bring them in. And so that's what we're going to do. And by the way, if you read The Athletic, if you have a subscription, which why wouldn't you? It's so freaking cheap, and there's so much content on there, and there are no ads. And the great thing about The Athletic is you don't have the pop-unders, the pop-ups. It doesn't disable your browser. That's the number one reason why I don't go to websites. But if you have a subscription to The Athletic, go there now and read Richard Deitch's new media column. It just came out today. We're in it, Sports by Brooks on Fancred. We're in that column. He is one of the big sports media influencers, if you will. And so go check that out. And nice little piece about Sports by Brooks on Fancred. So it was nice of Dean Blandino to drop in. And he has actually done a really nice job, seamless job, if you will, on Fox Sports first couple of weeks, especially when you consider what a crazy last day it's been in the NFL. And here's the thing. I think in some ways, the officials are kind of getting a bit of an overkill or a beatdown, if you will, that they don't necessarily deserve on that one fumble in the Rams-Saint game. Sure, they blew it, right? But it doesn't rise to the level of what happened in the NFC Championship game. It's not even in the neighborhood, all right? So, when I think about things like that, inconsistencies, clearly the NFL is making an effort to make it better. The officials, they're trying their best. There has to be some accountability. You'd like to see it out in public too. You'd like to know what officials are on the game and make that a bigger part of the broadcast. I think you should in television and in the media. We should know, I think, who's doing the game. Why not? Why wouldn't you? I mean, that's something that we're more aware of in the NBA. And if you follow the NBA for a long time, you might remember that NBA officials once upon a time, and to an extent now, but once upon a time, were very well known. College basketball officials, very well known. It's a different animal. They're out on this field 500 miles away from the crowd and the cameras in football. So it's a little bit more intimate with basketball, but I'd like some more transparency with NFL officials. Now, when it comes to a lack of integrity, all right, I don't have as much of a problem with the officiating right now because the NFL is trying. They're doing what they can. I think they're bogging the game down. I think they're killing the game to an extent right now. They are, because every time a touchdown is scored, it's like touchdown. Okay, what happened? Right? Is there a penalty? That's a big problem right now. And, they've got to dial back some of the reviews, especially when we get to the playoffs. Every single play, it seems like, is reviewed. But when it comes to integrity, lack thereof, when it comes to integrity, you look at the Miami Dolphins right now and what they're doing. It's a disgrace. It's an embarrassment. It's a joke. How can you have a betting line? How can you have a line on those games, the Dolphin games, when they're clearly tanking? I mean, and nobody, we're sitting here screaming about human error. We're screaming about the NFL trying to make it better, right? But what about the Dolphins? Why is nobody talking about the Dolphins? Why is nobody talking about Stephen Ross allowing this to go on? Right? I mean, it's not the coaching staff. They have nothing to do with it. And to an extent, it's not the front office. They may have made the call on what to do here, how to go about it, but ultimately it's ownership. I mean, how can you spend money on those tickets? It's a long-term investment, I suppose. It's almost like if you're a Dolphins fan or any fan these days, because tickets are so pricey, they're so expensive, that it's almost like a buy and hold in the stock market with the Dolphins, right? You're buying, and they're down to a penny stock, even though you're overpaying for them. They're not worth, the number that's on that piece of paper, that piece of cardboard. Certainly those tickets aren't even worth you're not going to get face value, I would imagine. It just depends on who they're playing that week. But why else would you have season tickets? I suppose to sell to opposing fans. That's about it. But when it comes to integrity, when it comes to legitimacy, the NFL, it's been flying high. It's gotten a lot better. I mean, I think there was a huge blip with the NFC Championship game in making you question what's really going on. But the NFL's done what it can to try to address that. But the NFL needs to do what it can to stop what's going on with the Dolphins. That can't go on. That is what's going to kill the popularity of the league ultimately if you allow those things to take place, right? You can see there's been a correction, maybe an overcorrection, maybe an ill-advised attempt at a correction of the officiating. I don't know what you do with the Dolphins, but my first thought is, obviously you've got mismanagement going on there. You've got malfeasance going on there. You've got malpractice going on there. But does Stephen Ross have the money? If he has the money, what's going on? Why are they doing this? Why are they not trying to win? And they're basing it on what? They're going to get a quarterback, whether it's Tua out of Alabama. Who knows? Trevor Lawrence, not going to be available next year. So you're not going to get him. Jalen Hurts, I don't know. Are these franchise quarterbacks? Hard to say. They don't excite me that much. Is this something that's going to turn around? No, it's not. And they're gutting the team. To me, this should be, when you look at Sports Illustrated, Robert Klemko is writing articles. And look, I'm not criticizing Robert Klemko. I'm really actually not. The guy did some reporting on Antonio Brown. He went into his background. It's relevant right now. I think it is relevant. It's especially relevant if there's criminal charges. But he did track down people and a lady who was clearly treated inappropriately. She's not suing him. The other woman supposedly is going to talk to the National Football League this week about her complaint, her civil complaint against Antonio Brown, which, is really hard for me to take seriously when there's no criminal complaint. And she's asking for a lot of damages financially, So we're going to bring in Chris Myers here in a second. One of my old friends from KMPC Radio in Los Angeles, one of the great guys in sports media, We're going to bring Chris up now and talk to him about what's going on with him. What's going on, Chris?
Hey, good to talk to you. How you been?
I've been great, man. Great to hear your voice, see your face. And you were at the Vikings-Packers game, and we were just talking to Dean Blandino, of course, Fox Sports Rules analyst, and that was a big part of the conversation. I mean, what did you make of all that stuff that was flying around during that game?
Yeah, that was a game-changing call, and I think what bothered me, and even when John Hussey, the referee, Brooks, made that announcement, it was almost as if this was above me. This was New York or the replay official or somebody, because no flag was thrown initially. So that, to me, you say touchdown, the fans see a touchdown. If it's not called right away, if it's not obvious, this obviously is a reflection of what happened in that NFC Championship game. So it was a little bit awkward. Dean Blandino, I'm sure he told you, as he told us in the broadcast, that's something you wouldn't call normally. If you do, you got to throw the flag right away if you see it. But if you're going to analyze, well, every play afterward, they make sure a scoring is official to cross the goal line, catch the ball, all of those things. But then if you're going to nitpick every other little move, which I don't know if the league is trying to send a message that we've opened up an issue here that we, that's going to create a lot of this, because certainly I know the Vikings were upset about it. I thought it was kind of a game-changing, unnecessary call. Yes, technically, was it sound? Was it the right call? Probably so. The way it was administered, I think I have an issue with.
One of my big problems comes out of the Texans and Jags game, where because it's a lower interest game, you don't have as many cameras from CBS, right? So when we're talking about, this new situation, the new what makes something reviewable and the control somebody has in New York, somebody who's not on the field, and they're making judgments, aren't they making those judgments based on camera angles? You have less cameras, right? Absolutely. I mean, I think that is a fundamental issue, a fundamental problem. And I honestly think you shouldn't be instituting this sort of situation if you don't have a standardization of the number of cameras and angles.
Yeah, and you shouldn't initiate unless someone there wants
right.
it looked at more closely. Here's another thing, Brooks, that the league employs the clock operator at each stadium, but the teams employ those who run the video jumbo screens at home, the home screen, and they decide what they want to show or not show. Some of that, now the refs are not allowed to use that as video evidence, but some officials have told me they'll peek up there and look at that if the TV screen
that's crazy.
Give them enough. It is crazy, and the league should have the same amount at Sunday Night Football and the late afternoon Fox doubleheader. They have many more cameras than some of the other games. Well, not many more, but more angles, more ways to catch certain things. And so I think, yes, there has to be a certain number of cameras. Maybe you could add more if you want, but in certain places, I think, to make it fair in and around the league, and the NFL has the money, I think, to do that. In fact, in the future, I think they'll find a way to administer the home screen video, because they have cameras in places into the officiating and then into the TV broadcast, so the viewer can also see it, not, as long as the person at home is looking up at the screen.
Visiting with Chris Myers of Fox Sports. Chris, and I asked Dean this question, and it's a question I think that every viewer out there at some point has in the back of their mind. When we're going through all the reviews, right, an instant we're trying to figure it out with the NFL, the replay official in the booth, the people down on the field. What kind of influence, if any, do you think have? Do you guys personally think, from your conversation and what you're asking for, if you are asking for angles, do you guys have any impact on how that judgment may go ultimately? Has that ever happened?
No, well, I think the impact is what you said, that I know that as soon as there is a play that we need to look at, or there's a challenge, our producer, our director, we're scrambling to get every possible angle. And the minute there is a score anyway, we're looking in a break to make sure, okay, let's show the viewer the best angle of how this happened, whether it's challenged or not. And so I guess if we don't have a camera in a spot, and here's another point, that if we don't get to a replay in a certain amount of time before someone can challenge. Once there's a challenge, we exhaust the time, as the referees do and the replay official. But if we can't get to that replay in time where a coach is looking or wondering if he should challenge or not, then that's a missed opportunity. So yes, there's influence, whether it's intentional or not.
Man, what an interesting division. And you look at the Vikings and the Packers, and now after that unbelievable finish with the Bears and the Broncos, but you are right in the middle of that whole storm with the Vikings and the Packers. I mean, what are some of your general thoughts that came out of that game?
Well, I think the division, Brooks, the defenses are very strong. Aaron Rodgers is clearly the best quarterback in the division when healthy, and he is. Boy, his arm looked great. I think that's going to be the difference maker. It's almost like the Bears are coaching a little bit around their quarterback, even though we know their defense is top notch. The Lions are still trying to figure it out. The Vikings defense, which looked like a modern day purple people eaters.
Purple people eaters.
Yes, there you go. A little old reference for you. After week one, that changed in a hurry in the opening of the first half, but then they adjusted and played well enough to win that game. I could not believe, and it almost sounded like Paul Allen calling Brett Favre's interception in the NFC Championship game as a Viking quarterback against the Saints. I just could not believe that Kirk Cousins, who had on a 1st and goal, and I don't know if he was trying to throw that ball away, but to throw it in the corner on a lob
first down,
yeah. And for King, and our angle, you couldn't even see it, but King made a great effort there to intercept that ball. To me, that was the ball game right there. And I know Matt LaFleur said, we're ahead in the takeaways. That's why we're 2-0, and they have a championship defense, and Aaron Rodgers has emphasized that in Green Bay. So I think that's tilting things early, not just by the record, but by looking at what I've seen of the other teams in their favor. And the LaFleur-Rodgers relationship, I think, will get better because I've been around Sean McVay from the beginning when he's been around Goff, and I see that it's not the same because of the age, of course, of the quarterbacks, but I see that getting better. We only saw a little progress of that in their second game on the offensive results.
Of course, NFL fandom and the media, what we do is all about overreaction, especially early in the season, right? And so I got to ask you, to me, today, the most fascinating story playing out in the NFL for me today is Mike Tomlin, the Steelers, Ben Roethlisberger, because you don't have the weapons there on offense right now. The defense doesn't seem like it's coming around the way they would like, and it hasn't shown signs, over the last couple of years. I mean, do you think we literally are? I mean, if Ben goes under the knife, we're looking at the end of an era, possibly?
Yes, I do. And I think just like we saw in Green Bay with Mike McCarthy there all those years, and he had his quarterback, I think coaches run their course. We used to talk about this on the radio, Brooks, where even if they're good at their job and the players are doing their, it just after a certain amount of time, I mean, those days of a guy on the job for 20 years, I think are gone in the NFL. And so maybe that's happening in Pittsburgh. I think what disappointed me before this year in the last few years with the Steelers was they used to have a quality defense, a top-notch defense, and they haven't had that, even when Bell and Brown were there and Ben, and they were putting up points offensively. So that's compelling to me. I think the Drew Brees injury, the news of the surgery and the thumb, 6 weeks he could come back from that. But again, given his age and the wear and tear on a quarterback's body and how he responds to that, how do the Saints hold up in the meantime in that, although that division seems pretty balanced in the NFC South, that's another storyline that I'm watching.
And I want to ask you about the Rams and that division suddenly has gotten really interesting. And it's not a sleeper team. How can you call them a sleeper? But I think Seattle is a team that people really hadn't been accounting for sufficiently. Russell Wilson, kind of a mystery when you figure the enormous contract, he just keeps winning. But here's my thing. I'm not that high on the Rams. People are all over saying how great Jared Goff is playing, at least in this last game. I mean, you look at the second half of last year, when they played good defenses, he did not play well. And I'm not necessarily seeing, a revelatory start from him. I mean, how do you feel about the Rams?
Well, I'm a believer in the Rams, and I'm around them. I think they've taken a set of receivers and Robert Woods and Cooks, and they don't have Pro Bowl tight ends. Gurley's situation.
Well, you got Kupp too.
Yeah. Kupp is a reliable, sure-handed guy. Yeah, there's an old Jack Snow reference for Ram fans.
Really? Notre Dame guy.
There you go, number 84. He reminds me of that Cooper Kupp. But I like that Goff and McVay are on the same page, and I think that the unit and the philosophy of McVay and them working together makes him better. He can make all the throws, and I think that what I like about this Ram team, and again, Wade Phillips on the defensive side, they cannot play their best, because I called their opener in Carolina and I was with them through the championship run last year until the Super Bowl. That was their worst game under McVay and Goff since they've been together. But I think they can not play their best and still win the game. And that road win in New Orleans, that's when Goff impressed me with the noise and some of the things he was up against. But yeah, he's still okay. Would you rather have him or Carson Wentz? I mean, that's where the battle goes back and forth.
Right.
But he's good enough. We saw it to get to the Super Bowl. You're right about that division, and the 49ers are better. So you're not going to walk over them. And Arizona with their quarterback and their rookie Murray will be more of a challenge. So that'll be a fun division to watch. But yes, I still think the Rams, not only the team to beat, I think in the NFC, I don't see anybody that I'd put ahead of them. I wouldn't say, hey, they're the clear choice. But I just think they're capable of beating anybody else, whether it's the Cowboys, the Eagles, the Packers, whoever.
But one thing I want to mention, and obviously we're on we have to embrace it. We have to embrace debate here, Chris.
Oh, do we? Really? Okay.
We're on the opposite ends of the spectrum on the Rams.
Okay.
Because I'm not all that high on the Rams, but I am higher on the Rams with Cooper Kupp. And as I go back to last year, and I mentioned after about week 11, after the Kansas City game, I mean, he had gotten hurt the week before. But after the crazy Kansas City game where the Chiefs can't stop anybody, Goff didn't seem like he was the same. I mean, I wanted to ask you a question. If Cooper Kupp had stayed healthy, do you think they would have won the Super Bowl? Yeah,
yes. I think he is Goff's, and we've seen this over the years. The term security blanket, there's probably a better way to say that now, but he is that guy. And Goff has told, Kupp sits in the quarterback meetings, not only receiver meetings. He'll go in the offensive line. He asks questions of Goff when they're not at practice that get Goff thinking about the game. Goff said to help make him better. His father played in the league. He's really got the mind of a coach. I think that factor with Kupp, he's the key guy. And I also think that Gurley, whatever's happening there, and he keeps saying,
"What is happening, Chris? I mean, what is that? You're here. What is going on?"
I don't even think the Rams, when we met with McVay, he's like, we're curious to see this year how he responds. I think they're trying to pace him, but I think they know that there's a chronic, without being a doctor, a chronic knee issue that could worsen over time after you just gave a guy a lot of money and after he's shown, his brilliance in running and catching. That's the other part. It's a very important part of the receiving game too. So I think that adjustment and obviously having Kupp out had a major effect on the Rams because their defense, the Ram defense in the Super Bowl, they played. That's the best I've ever seen the Patriots defended in a Super Bowl, and they played well enough to win that game. But that offense in that game was horrendous.
At some point, we're going to talk boxing on this show. Okay.
Oh, okay, good. All right. I do like Spence, by the way. I'm leaning towards Spence in the Porter.
Well, that's not exactly going out on the limb here.
I know, but it's down the road, and we've got other issues in boxing that we have to get to. And I'm glad you always were a big boxing fan.
I am.
Yes, and still are.
I'm going to drag you back on here. We're going to talk some boxing. All right, Chris. I can't thank you enough, man, for the time.
All right, anytime. I always enjoy talking to you. Take care, Brooks.
Thanks. That's Chris Myers of Fox Sports. Great guy. Used to do radio with him in Los Angeles. And I could talk about him all day because if you watch him and watch him work, and I think a good example, if you watched his PBC boxing broadcasts recently, working with analysts, Joe Goosen and Lennox Lewis on boxing broadcasts, phenomenal. Chris has done a great job. I think he's the kind of announcer. Now, if you're a boxing purist, well, Chris isn't a boxing guy, but Chris is the exact guy I think that would be great, that is great for the sport of boxing because people know who he is. He's a mainstream guy. People who don't necessarily know all the fighters out there, right? Or might not gravitate to the fighters. They know Chris, and Chris is the guy, having worked with him as I have, who tries to pull everybody together so we're all pulling in the same direction. So if you watch Chris Myers in particular and his relationships with his on-air analysts and whoever's working the sidelines, doing interviews, he is that kind of a personality. I know firsthand. And so, and just talking to him, it's just fun talking to the guy. He's an upbeat person, and we're going to have him on again. And we'll talk, obviously, NFL. He's everywhere for Fox. And so that was a lot of fun. We're going to talk to Eric Edholm. We're going to go around the league with him a little bit more. I want to get what he thinks about Antonio Brown. We're also going to talk to Robert Littell of Black Sports Online. And there's really no better person outside of Robert Klemko, who wrote the story for SI. But in my thought process, I want to have Robert Latala on from Black Sports Online just as much as I want Robert Klemko at this point, who wrote this news story about Antonio Brown, some of the problems. But Robert can really speak to that because it's a lot of what we talked about last week. Remember, we talked last week about how if you follow Black Sports Online, BSO on Twitter, right, you already knew about 80% of the stuff. You had already read about 80% of the stuff that Antonio Brown had been doing off the field. And it's not much different than a ton of players in the NFL and the NBA in terms of their personal life being on display. Now, all of the lawsuits, about the debts, things like that, him stiffing people, troubling, obviously, but not criminal. And the woman who talks about in this news story, the new piece of reporting in it, in the Robert Klemko story about Antonio Brown, is about a woman was painting a mural of Brown at his home, and he was walking around with a washcloth over his genitals, and I guess standing right behind her, something like that, something wildly inappropriate, but of course not surprising, unfortunately. And there was no lawsuit. There was no criminal complaint lodged. Look, if you want to press charges, you want to go out, and I'm not excusing what he's doing, but this happens all too often. And if there's no criminal complaint that's put out there, again, this is wildly inappropriate, should not be happening. It makes me personally sick that he's doing that sort of stuff with women around, and he knows what he's doing, and he knows that he shouldn't be doing it. But if there's no criminal complaint, how are we to know that these things aren't consensual, or at least perceived as consensual with him? We don't know. And in this particular article that just came out in SI, on SINow.com, Sports Illustrated, from Robert Klemko, there's no indication that the woman who was the artist, the painter who was painting the mural of Brown at his home, complained about it. It sounds like she just left the next day. Don't blame her, of course. But look, to me, if this is not criminal, I'm not going to say it's character assassination, but maybe it is to a certain extent. It's piling on because there's a lot of guys out there who are in similar situations, similarly odd behavior that is enabled by people around him, enabled, in my opinion, to a certain extent by the media. I mean, look at this. We're sitting here talking about these things. There's no criminal action that's being taken, right? Now, this woman, Brittany Taylor, is talking to the NFL. That's a serious matter, but it's a civil complaint. And it's a very interesting case because Antonio Brown's representative, Darren Heitner, the lawyer, came out with a statement with very specific points addressing Brittany Taylor's claim in civil court. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But the one thing I'll promise you, is that he is going nowhere with the Patriots. Nowhere. The Patriots showed you on the field, in my opinion, how they feel about him yesterday in the way they forced the ball into him. They went out of their way, the Patriots did, with Antonio Brown to get him into the offense. And, of course, Tom Brady invited Antonio Brown over to his house at the TB12 training facility, all those things. So we'll talk some Antonio Brown here now with Eric Edholm, one of my favorite guys on Twitter. Eric Edholm. I highly recommend that you follow him. He is a guy who just gets quit. Eric, I appreciate you joining us, by the way. Thanks, man.
How are you?
I'm doing good. And you're one of these guys I hate because you're so much better on Twitter than I am.
Oh, man.
And you just, I don't know what to say. Some people are, you know what I'm talking about. There's like a short list of people who are just born to do Twitter and to point things out and entertain us. So, and on Twitter, you are Eric _Edholm, EDHOLM. And I want to talk, Eric, about the NFL today. And this has been just an unbelievable first couple of weeks, thanks in part to Antonio Brown, right? But then we had about as good a week of games yesterday as I can remember. It's it's a circus. And now we get this story coming out again.
Yeah. And first of all, thank you for the kind recommendation there and everything. I think my wife would disagree that I'm born for Twitter. She wishes I would spend less time on it, but another matter entirely. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the preseason, other than the Brown story, I kept saying to myself, boy, is this setting up to be a bad year? I don't know. I just sort of was trending in that direction, but we've already had, 4 starting quarterbacks go down, I guess, if you count Sam Darnold here, and the Brown stuff and him being a Patriot now and playing like he did yesterday and all the off-field concerns with that. It really has been wild, and we're setting up for a game tonight, Jets and Browns, 2 promising teams entering the season that are in kind of must-win mode right now. So you're right. It's all out there for us to take in.
So I first want to address, I talked to Chris Myers about this 1 second ago, name check, that you got the Pittsburgh Steelers sitting there. And, of course, NFL fandom, NFL media, sports media, all about overreaction. Absolutely. And I'm overreacting, I suppose, with the Steelers, but I don't think I am. I think this is the end for them. What do you think?
It's hard not to look at the situation and say, boy, Ben Roethlisberger, 37, has taken a lot of damage over the years. Now this elbow injury, season-ending variety. They do have Mason Rudolph there. If he plays well, look, I mean, I think they value him a lot higher than the 3rd-round pick that they used on him, so there's that to consider. They may end up with a high pick, which could put them in a position to draft another quarterback, what could be a QB-rich draft. You have Mike Tomlin kind of at a crossroads here. I absolutely could see the end coming. I don't want to, project doom for a team that has started 0-2 4 times in the last 20 years, and every single time they were 500.
Yeah, I saw that.
They have a history of it. Granted, it's a couple different coaches doing it, but still, I had high expectations for this team in the sense that I thought really getting rid of some of the headaches and the distractions and everything else could end up being addition by subtraction. I thought they might be a really competitive football team this year. So far, we haven't seen it. And it does feel like, this has been at least kind of a flashpoint for their future. And there's no doubt that Ben's future in Pittsburgh is up in the air right now.
Interesting, though, if you think back, easy to say, but do you think the Steelers wish they had Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown right about now?
I think it's a little unfair to say that, like James Conner isn't carrying the load or Juju Smith-Schuster isn't doing his part. But I do think it's, it's that whole trade-off of what are you willing to put up with. With Brown, I think most Steelers fans are like, no, you know what? We've been down that road. We saw how hard it crashed there at the end. That's not a place we're willing to go. Depending on how Bell does, I could see that argument holding some credence in some Steelers fans' minds. But right now it's been an underperforming defense, the inconsistency of the offense to kind of generate drives consistently. Maybe that changes with Rudolph. Look, he stepped in and at least made some throws, but, we'll see. It's hard not to be a little bit discouraged right now.
Visiting with Eric Edholm of Yahoo Sports. I don't know about you, but I'm thinking when we get to the playoffs, these last 2-minute reviewable PI thing that we have going, that's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a disaster. It's already during the playoffs, borderline disaster, the way it slows the game down. But now this is my thought on it. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think there's already been enough kind of concern about how this rule is being implemented and enforced and how, it's being called on the field and whether there's sort of a change in philosophy on that. The other thing I witnessed yesterday, and especially in Broncos Bears, was, the fouls that used to be known as playing football, right? I mean, Bradley Chubb there, the hit at the end really propelled the Bears to be in field goal range. I thought it was a clean football play. The Bears had 2 plays earlier in the game, Eddie Goldman, Leonard Floyd, roughness calls or roughing the quarterback calls that I thought were very, very questionable. So you now have officials really in the crosshairs for things that are out of their hands with the rule changes. I mean, look, we're asking these guys to sort of spin plates and perform acrobatics on a weekly basis with this is arcane and voluminous rule book that they've created. But then also, they're kind of heightened awareness to some of these fouls that I don't think should be flagged. So there's a real focus on, the quality of officiating right now. And some of that is the NFL's doing, some of that's the officials on the field.
I mentioned this to our two previous guests today, but one of my big problems, with taking the game out of the hands of the officials on the field is like in the CBS game, you had the Texans and the Jags, and you could make the argument if that wasn't a D game or an F game, they would have had more cameras. Fournette may have been shown to get in, but we don't have any standardization. So if we don't have any standardization of the camera setup for all these games, you cannot have people not on the field making calls.
Yeah, I agree. And even just to bring that Bears game back, Kyle Fuller makes that interception near his own goal line. There were some people saying his knee never went down. I saw an angle from the TV view, but there was no clear definitive angle on that either. So you mentioned the Fournette thing. I mean, other examples as well. And you're right, to have that standardized, replay and camera angle view, I think it's got to be the same across the board. We got to apply the same technology to all these games and hold everybody to the same standard. As we get closer to the playoffs, it won't matter as much anymore. Every game reaches that level, but still, who's to say that a week 2 game that we don't deem important now isn't going to be crucial down the road because of standings and everything else like that, tiebreakers and everything that factors in. So you're right there about it. If you're gonna use these tools, we've got to use them to their fullest extent, I think, and their fairest extent.
Well, and again, if you've got people who aren't on the field, they're not at the stadium. And I mean, and you don't have a standardized bunch of cameras. That's insane. One thing that I think is kind of an elephant in the room, or maybe it isn't, but is gambling, is betting. Why should it be the elephant in the room? It should be right out in front of us. We should be talking about it more, I think. But when you go back to the NFC Championship game, which prompted all of this, right? Yeah. There was no talk about that game being fixed. No talk about any funny, but I shouldn't even say it now. Ooh, but I mean, isn't it with I understand it's all about business. It's all about Terry Bradshaw's money, right? But it's a little strange to me that no one's talking about any funny business, especially when you look at the history of the game and how so much of this is all subjective.
Yeah, and I think the NFL would like no one to talk about it.
Shut up.
Yeah, for years, gambling and handicapping was all verboten, and nobody could talk about it, and the NFL wasn't going to discuss it. Obviously, they've warmed up quite a bit. Games in London where gambling's legal. Raiders are headed to Vegas.
Well, but the networks, I think, Eric.
Yes,
I think that they have changed the game. When you look at an ESPN. Just look at what am I saying? I was going to say them having a studio in Caesars, but what about their Daily Wager? What about Fox Bet? I think that now I don't know. It's just troubling to me.
Oh, there's no doubt the media focus on handicapping and gambling has changed completely along with it. You have partnerships now, and you have folks devoted their careers to this, and it's out in front, not kind of buried in the back, so to speak. And the other element of handicapping too, and the question about whether games are on the level, I don't think anyone in the NFL actually believes, for instance, that the Miami Dolphins are truly tanking. Like, we're going to put high school kids out there and lose games like that. Even fixed boxing matches have an air of question about them, right? So, but just the fact that anybody could bring up the idea that some of these games are decided by outside forces scares the heck out of the NFL. They knew it was Pandora's box going into it, but it was the price they paid for knowing they were doing business.
Let me just tell you, you're not going to be able to get away with that forever. We're going to be talking about this more and more. And man, you took the words right out of my mouth, because I wanted to ask you about this, and I was talking about this early on the show. We're sitting here and we're ripping into the officials as the big problem right now. Yeah. That's human error, right? But now when you look at the Miami Dolphins, I think when you talk about the integrity of the league, at least it appears the league is trying to make amends for what happened in the NFC Championship game with the non-call, with all of this kind of overcorrection stuff, right? Yeah. But at least they're trying. But when you look at the Miami Dolphins and what Ross is being allowed to do, I think that really is what strikes at the integrity of the league.
Yeah, and I think you have to ask yourself, what are people willing to put up with, right? If you're a Cleveland Browns fan and you've endured, decades of losing and getting top picks and top 5 selections and, letting good players walk in free agency, all with this goal of improving down the road. Look, I know they're 0-1. I know they didn't play well in week 1, but you can at least say, look, Baker Mayfield, Myles Garrett, being able to trade picks for Odell Beckham, this sort of thing, it's at least created infrastructure with some elite talent. That is what Miami Dolphins officials will say is their model, right? We are trying to sort of do, in maybe a shorter time frame, what the Browns took years to do. If you sell it that way, I think there are some fans who are saying, you know what, I understand, take a step back now for a longer term gain. But most folks are going to sit there and say, well, then why am I paying for season tickets to go to games? Why am I investing in this team for the hope of something great? Because you still got to make those draft picks. You still have to be able to convince people to play there. That's a real hard sell right now. And I think it strikes to what you're talking about, which is a non-competitive team right now.
And this is, again, why I love following you and following what you do. We're talking to Eric Edholm. He's on Twitter at Eric_EDHOLM. He's with Yahoo Sports. Incredible follow, especially on game day. But he also specializes in the NFL draft. And I think this really speaks to what we're talking about because you're an expert on the NFL draft. You've done a deep dive on NFL draft history. And so based upon all of that experience, you have a lot deeper knowledge of the history of the NFL draft, what that portends maybe for the Miami Dolphins. I've always said that what tanking really represents is covering up malfeasance. The media essentially is covering up for the Dolphins to an extent, the incompetence of the front office and, of course, the owners that hire those people. But how realistic is it to think that the Dolphins could get themselves at least to 8-8 or, a competitive team through the draft in 1 year?
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, I think, is that you could come into a draft with a boatload of picks and doesn't guarantee you're going to get it right, okay? Unless you trade those
assets.
For no. Yeah, right. Assets. Great. They just give you a seat at the table. They don't let you may have a pile of chips when you sit down, but when you leave, it may be a little different story. I've done that once or twice in my life. So yeah, I say to myself, is Tua Tagovailoa the most sure thing quarterback prospect we've ever seen?
Right.
Is there enough firepower in the rest of the draft to guarantee that they're going to get these picks right or the majority of these picks right? You can't definitively say yes. And if you have second-year players like Minkah Fitzpatrick, asking out, if you have Kenyon Drake, a young talented player on the trade block reportedly, what does it say about the culture and the structure you're building there as a destination for people? Is it being somewhere people want to play? Eli Manning forced his way out of playing for San Diego. There are other, Baker Mayfield made it clear there was a small amount of teams he kind of wanted to play for. Who's to say one of those draft quarterbacks can't play that kind of a power move heading into 2020? So there's so many other factors that they have to correct before they can even make the correct picks, which is it's a huge daunting task right now.
How much of the fact that the Dolphins are getting away with this is just my opinion, but is the media's fault? Or is it? Or, in that everything's propaganda to an extent, and we're all promoting the game, much like we're all ignoring the possibility that NFC Championship game was fixed. There's not a single article by a mainstream media outlet that was written to suggest something like that, which is a little amazing. And I think when you look at the incompetence of the front office of Miami, you look at the incompetence of the ownership of Ross, why isn't there more being made of this as it relates to just the integrity of the league? How can you have betting lines out there with a team like this?
Yeah, the betting line part is going to be fascinating. Right. I'm not a huge handicapping guy, but I'm going to be watching every Dolphins line. You saw it last week from 14.5 to 21, and they lost by 43. So right. Even cover half of the spread. So that's going to be an element that's going to be worth watching. How the media handles Stephen Ross and his leadership. We've seen Cleveland writers go after Jimmy and Dee Haslam. Right. seen Redskins writers go after Daniel Snyder. We've seen other teams with shaky ownership, track records of failure, kind of turn against the owner, because it does trickle down from the top. I really believe that. Good, successful teams tend to have good, successful owners, and that's, and being a successful businessman outside of the NFL doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be good in the league. So I do think there, even though Miami may not be kind of that media boiling pot, I do think there will be enough negative attention against them to suggest that just because you pick first in the draft, or just because you accumulate assets, doesn't mean you're going to be good. Just because you burn down the forest doesn't mean it's going to regrow into some kind of splendor. So those things cannot be swept under the rug, no doubt about it.
And I think it might have something to do with, the state of the Miami Dolphins franchise. If we were talking about the Patriots, not too far removed from this era that we have right now, and suddenly I think there might have been, or there might be, maybe the Giants and the Jets, if they were endeavoring to do something like this the way the Dolphins are, but it's so blatant. I can't remember ever seeing anything like this blatant. But I wanted to ask you, and I keep bringing it up over and over, but it's worth mentioning because I love following you on Twitter. It's so entertaining. TweetDeck is just amazing to see everybody. It's like a waterfall of tweets, and you just have your best guys. But describe what you're thinking, what your thought process is like on game day, and what you're doing with Twitter.
My immediate thought is, wow, I wish I did not have ADHD, because watching a TV and Twitter and trying to write and do all these things at once really kind of turns my brain into scrambled eggs.
It does.
I try to medicate as best I can. I try to be focused, be well fed, get the distractions when I'm at home, and get the distractions out of the room. When I'm in a press box is a different story. But yeah, no, I probably tweet too much. That's
No, you don't. But I be the judge of that. I'll be the judge of that.
I'll leave it in your hands. But I try to find things that are a little bit quirky and interesting and a little off the radar, and stuff that kind of catches my eye, whether it's a oddball stat, whether it's some unusual thing that happened between a play or during a timeout or whatever. I guess I just try to look for the stuff that I find interesting. Some of it people are going to go, okay, whatever, no big deal. Others, they're going to say, whoa, yeah, look at that. Like last night, I put up a video of some Eagles player with flowing hair getting blown.
No, that was unbelievable. It looked like a poodle. It looked like a poodle on his head.
Funny, yeah. Sometimes it's silly stuff.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
I have a stream of consciousness vibe on Twitter on game days, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
It's amazing. Well, Eric, I really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much for the time, man.
Yeah, it's awesome being with you. I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you real soon.
Thank you, Eric. That's Eric Edholm from Yahoo Sports. He is an NFL draft expert, and I kind of sold him short on that. That's one of the things that he really focuses on. And he's got a cool story about the history of the NFL draft and the all-time worst NFL draft classes. And so I think when you look at the Dolphins situation, particularly, nobody is better, I think, to speak to this situation with the Dolphins right now and the tanking that's going on. It's clearly tanking. And my whole point about it, and I've mentioned this before, I've mentioned this point on Twitter quite a bit, is we just hear the word tanking and everybody with that team gets a pass. Oh, it's tanking. It's a strategy. No, it isn't. It's your team's effed because your front office and your owner suck. They're not doing their job. It's malfeasance. They have no idea what they're doing. So that's the problem, I think, in what I'm trying to get to with Eric. And you can hear me almost kind of trying to force that there. It's like, well, it's the media's fault, right? Well, not necessarily, because as he pointed out, there's been plenty of negative media attention on Dan Snyder, which ultimately, what does it amount to? Nothing. You get what you get there. But I think in this particular case, not using the term tanking, reporting it for what it is. I mean, how do the Dolphins get away with gutting all the talent off their team? And now you've got their best young talent asking out. It's being reported. How is that allowed to happen? Why does the league let that take place? You know? So my point is that the media has some accountability here. It's, to me, the responsibility of the media to tell people what's really going on. Call a spade. And in the context of gambling and betting in particular, I think this is an important issue, because now, folks, gambling, sports betting, if you don't already know, is a freaking way of life. And it's only going to continue to be more so a way of life as we continue to legalize it state to state. So all of the issues that we've talked about today, every single one, they all relate to gambling and betting. Every one. I remember going back, and you can go on archive.org, that website, archive.org, and do a search for CBS 60 Minutes NFL gambling, right? 60 Minutes once upon a time did a hit piece on the NFL over gambling, over betting. And there's been many scandals in the past that came out in the public as it pertains to the NFL, and also that were covered up as it pertains to the NFL. And of course, all commercial spectator sports. But now, here's the thing, and here's the important point to be made. The important point to be made. Follow me, all right? Understand. Well, we're going to talk to Paul. We're going to get back to this because there's one more thing I really haven't made a point about. But I first want to go out to Pittsburgh, and we want to talk to a guy who's in the eye of the storm right now. I think the biggest story in the NFL going, Paul Zeiss, who is an esteemed columnist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and talk show host on 93.7 The Fan in Pittsburgh. Paul, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I've been talking to everybody all day on this show about what I think is the biggest story right now in the NFL, and it's the Steelers. And as I've said before, fandom's all about overreaction. Media's all about overreaction. Could this be the end of the era for the Steelers? A era. We're having trouble with Paul's audio here. Is that on my end? We'll get Paul back up here in a second. We appreciate him hanging out with us on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. And if we have trouble with Paul, just whatever you think we should do here, Cam Smith, our producer in Boston, doing a great job. We're here every day, Monday through Friday, noon to 2. And we're working with Paul Zeiss, looking to get him back up on the show. We'll hopefully get a chance to talk to Robert Littell of Black Sports Online about the Antonio Brown thing coming up. But Paul wrote a very interesting article about the quarterback situation with the Pittsburgh Steelers, saying that he thinks that it may be time, or maybe it is time, to move on from Ben Roethlisberger and go with Mason Rudolph, who did not play badly yesterday. And Roethlisberger, long in the tooth, to say the least. Of course, this is the first year of a 3-year deal that Roethlisberger recently signed. Huge signing bonus, be a big financial hit for the Steelers, not one of the richest franchises in the NFL. And I really want to talk to him about that particular perspective, because it certainly dovetails into what's going on right now. So whatever you can imagine here, whatever you can manage, Cam, we'll try to get Paul up and continue that conversation. But we've also been talking about, Antonio Brown, of course, and I think that's something that Paul can definitely give us some insight on, having been in Pittsburgh for quite some time and throughout Antonio Brown's tenure with the Steelers. Of course, more coming out today about Antonio Brown from SI Now's Robert Klemko, with a long story about some of the off-the-field issues that Antonio Brown has been dealing with in his life. Other people have been dealing with because of Antonio Brown's irresponsibility, inability, or unwillingness to pay his debts, inappropriate behavior around a particular woman that is a news story that has come out, a woman who was painting a mural of Antonio Brown at his home and Brown was nude while she was in the process of painting that mural with, I guess it's a hand towel or something, over his genitals. This woman reported this to Robert Klemko in the SI Now story. There was no criminal complaint. And this woman actually said that she didn't respond other than to abruptly, quote, abruptly, unquote, leave Antonio Brown's home the next day after her attempt to paint a mural of him. So obviously inappropriate behavior. And I can hear Boston sports radio and television today. Get rid of him. It's just got to be one thing after another, right? What's next? What's next is nothing, guys. Now you can fill your radio talk shows with that conversation. That's fine. But the conversation should be about Bill Belichick. The conversation should be about Tom Brady. Clearly, they're all in on Antonio Brown. And I would be absolutely shocked. Now that I've said it, I'm not checking the wire. Antonio Brown was released or something like that right in the middle of this, right in the middle of me monologuing about it. So we're working on getting Paul Zeiss back if we can from Pittsburgh. I've been a big fan of Paul's over the years. One of the more outspoken guys, insightful guys, and he's right there. So let's work on that, Cam, and see what we can do. And hopefully we'll get a chance. Hey, Paul.
I'm back.
Man, I'm so glad that you're here because you're really kind of on the vanguard, I think, of the situation in Pittsburgh. You wrote a really interesting article. Tell us about your perspective on that quarterback situation.
Well, I think the one thing that people, and first of all, thanks for having me on. I think people forget, you know what, guys get old. It happens in every sport all the time. And also, there are some guys who at some point they lose, I don't want to say their passion, but they lose whatever it is that drives them. And that sort of, I think, has gone on a little bit with Ben. I think, these last 2 years have really kind of beaten him down. And I think that he's at a place right now where, he just doesn't look like he's having that much fun. He's never been a guy that's really related to the younger guys on the team over the last 5 to 7 years. He just doesn't. I don't want to say he's an old guy because obviously he's younger than me, but he just doesn't relate a lot of times. And so when you have a changing roster, which let's face it, the Steelers are a changing roster. They're going to a lot more younger players, guys on the receiving core, running backs, whatever. Really, the only veterans on the offense are pretty much the linemen. So, to me, it just looked like this year he just didn't have it. Now, it might just been the elbow injury was really bothering him, and that's a part of it. But you've got a guy waiting in the wings in Mason Rudolph. You drafted him for a reason, and I'll tell you, everything I've seen from him, I really like. I think I like his energy. I use the phrase he's got brass cojones. I just love the way he goes about his business. He looks to me like somebody who's ready to be a quarterback in the NFL. And so, to me, Ben's been great. He's a Hall of Famer, the best quarterback in my mind in Steelers history. But all good things come to an end. And I think at some point, if you are not getting the production out of him, you know what? You drafted Rudolph for a reason. So even before the injury was announced, the surgery, I mean, like you said in my column on Sunday, I said, it's time to turn it over to Mason Rudolph and see what he can do. So obviously there was very mixed reviews among people that read it in this town. Some people are ready to run me out of town, but there's a lot more than you probably think that agree that it's time. So and there's not it's not like there's not precedent for this. And I Ben himself was a rookie, if you remember, and Tommy Maddox got banged up a little bit or whatever, and the next thing you know, Ben becomes a starter and they go 15-1. So I'm not saying that's going to happen with Mason Rudolph. And of course, I had people going on and on about how, well, Tommy Maddox was a journeyman basically, and Ben was a first round pick. It's different. So then I turn it on and say, okay, well, how about Tom Brady and Drew Bledsoe? Do you remember that?
Sure.
Drew Bledsoe was the guy. He's probably I would say a borderline Hall of Famer. Probably not there, but he had a really, really good career. And guess what? Tom Brady was a 6th-round pick. And when it was his time, it was his time. So I just feel like Ben's done a lot of great things in this town, but all good things must come to an end.
How much blame do you think Mike Tomlin deserves in this situation? Is he being unfairly criticized? And what do you think his future is with that franchise?
Here's the thing. I think Mike Tomlin has done a lot of really good things, but here's what always comes back to with me. He's a defensive guy, and he has not been able to rebuild this defense. Once all the Super Bowl guys, and, I hate the whole thing about, well, he won with cowards players. I think that's stupid. But once all of those Super Bowl guys like Troy and James Harrison, all those guys got old, the defense has been the biggest problem on this team for, 6 years now, 7 years, something like that. And so he deserves, some of the blame for that, especially since he's got a very, very large hand in personnel decisions. And you look at their first-round picks and the guys that they've brought in. I mean, they did okay with Cam Hayward. Stephon Tuitt, I think, was a 2nd-round pick. They did okay there. J.T. Watt looks like he might be okay. But you look, there's a lot more, Jarvis Jones and Artie Burns and, a lot of even Bud Dupree. There's a lot of guys that they picked with high picks. It's not like this defense wasn't, they haven't devoted a lot to it. So he deserves blame for that. And I think the other part of it is, he deserves a little bit of blame for the fact that they had the killer bees for 5 years and did nothing with it. Really, if you really look at it,
right.
Brown,
Right.
Bell, and Ben, for 5 years, they were the most explosive trio in football. And there's not a lot to show for it because the defense was never really good enough to get them over the top.
Do you think if they could do it over again, Bell and Brown would still be on this team?
I don't think Bell would be. I think that if they could have figured something out with Brown, yes. I don't think, but here's the thing with Bell, they were not going to pay him the money that he wanted, guaranteed. And you know what? It's week 1, and we see, it's week 2, but after week 1, we already saw a glimpse of why. I mean, I don't know what his status is for tonight, but he needed an MRI on his shoulder. He's just never been durable. He's never been a guy who stays healthy. And their feeling is, you know what? We'll give you a lot of money up front, but we're not going to give you a bunch of guaranteed money for 3 or 4 years. And that was really the sticking point. And I think that in the NFL nowadays, they view the running back situation different than they did probably 20 or 30 years ago. But I do think if they could have figured something out to placate Antonio Brown and keep him here, they would have.
Talking to Balls Ice, of course, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette columnist and sports radio host in Pittsburgh on 93.7 The Game. What about Antonio Brown? How were they able to keep him under wraps for so long? I mean, is there a particular individual in that organization or an approach? And do you lay all the blame at the feet of Ben Roethlisberger, a portion of it, or all of it at the feet of Antonio Brown for the departure?
No, it was Antonio Brown. I mean, Ben became a very easy scapegoat. Let's face it, there's not very many star players less popular than Ben. It just, he's a guy that rubs people the wrong way. He obviously has a little bit of a sordid history. He's a little bit aloof, and some would say, douchey, if that's a word, So, I mean, the bottom line is, he became a real easy scapegoat and target. But Antonio Brown this has been an issue with him. I put some of the blame on Tomlin and Kevin Colbert and Art Rooney because they did a lot of different things to try him and to try and, basically they enabled a lot of this behavior before he was a star. And then when he became a star, I remember Mike Tomlin saying, something to the effect of, well, what am I going to do? Suspend him? What am I going to do? Cut off my nose to spite my face? Well, you know what? Sometimes you have to step in, and they never did. And it just grew into something ridiculous. And Antonio Brown, see, I look at Bell and Brown completely different. Bell did things the right way. He wanted more money. He basically said, I want more money. And he fought for it. He lost, but he bet on himself. I have no problem with that. I think that's what we were supposed to do. Antonio Brown wanted more money. And instead of just saying, I want a new contract, or I want more money, or I want this, or I want that, he goes the nuclear option, dyes his hair blonde, turns into a whack job, throws everybody under the bus, makes all these ridiculous excuses, has a couple of national media, what I call the fake God squad, like Deion Sanders, these guys, who he works out with, make all kinds of excuses for him and throw Ben under the bus. To me, it was 100% about money. And I know this. If the Steelers would have said, okay, last year, at the end of last year, okay, Antonio, tell you what, we're going to rip up your contract and give you a 4-year deal. We're going to make you the highest paid receiver. 3/4 of it will be guaranteed. I guarantee you, all of a sudden, all of these issues he quote unquote had with Ben would have gone away, within 30 seconds.
What about the theory about the perfect hit? What do you subscribe to that? Devontae's perfect hit having any sort of impact on him mentally?
No, I think he's just been. I think he's been a moron his entire career. I think it's just. Once he became a star, he just felt like he could do it out in the open. But
so he's in control of everything here. You're saying that he is in complete control. And he's a manipulative guy. None of this is kind of involuntary.
Yes, I don't buy it for a second. And I think that, he's just kind of a jerk. He's a narcissist. He's a jerk. He's not a good person. I mean, and I tell you, what's funny is I was reading this SI thing that just came out. What was it, today? Where they were talking about his debts and things of the such. Believe me, I know people in town personally that he has on things, and it's just his MO. It's who he is. He's a guy that really believes the world revolves around Antonio Brown, doesn't care about anybody else.
Paul, I can't thank you enough, man. Thanks for jumping on with us. Thanks so much.
No, thanks. I appreciate it. We'll get this next time. Hopefully now I have the thing down pat.
Absolutely, Paul. Absolutely. We'll have you back on and keep track of what's going on in your neck of the woods. That's Paul Zeiss, a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette columnist, giving us some great insight and a pretty provocative opinion about Mason Rudolph. He thinks Mason Rudolph, the quarterback for the Steelers, should be taken over right now for Ben Roethlisberger permanently. It's time to have a changing of the guard with the Steelers, and I honestly don't disagree with him. I think the bigger question for the Steelers is that roster, number one, and the defense and the inability of that defense to make adjustments. That's something that's great about Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you're following people like a Warren Sharp, right? He is exposing Pittsburgh and that defense for what it really is, and to a certain extent, offense. And it's, if Mike Tomlin, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this sounds a little bit crazy. If you're not on Twitter, you're not paying attention. But if and when Mike Tomlin is fired in short order, let's say within 2 years, I truly believe that what's going on with some of the work that's been done in social media on the Steelers in game as it's happening, and the lack of adjustments that the Steelers make, particularly on defense, I think it's going to come back and have an impact on the decision the Steelers make ultimately with Tomlin if they can't get this thing turned around, which I don't know why you would think they would, right? We're used to the Steelers always being this perennially solid, I think is the word, solid franchise. But as Paul pointed out, I mean, they had Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown, Ben Roethlisberger. They were all in their prime, or Roethlisberger a little late in his career to an extent. But they had those guys, and what did they do? What did they come up with? Absolutely nothing, ultimately, because if you're a Pittsburgh Steeler person, it's all about the Super Bowl. That's the standard for the Pittsburgh Steelers, not for franchises like Miami, I guess you could say, right? They're just trying to get their head above water. But it's a fascinating study, the Steelers, and everybody's always looking to overreact, I guess you could say, but we're always looking to make these vast proclamations about what's going to happen. Like I talked to Chris Myers earlier about the Rams, and I think the Rams, look, they've got a nice defense. Aaron Donald, the best in the game, right? The critical piece for the Rams is Cooper Kupp. If he comes back and stays healthy, he's already come back and continues to perform the way he did yesterday, maybe not at that level, but fulfilling his role as that underneath guy, the Jack Snow, if you will, old guy reference, former Ram, former member of the Notre Dame football team, that security blanket, that slot guy underneath. If Kupp can fulfill that role, I think the Rams are going to maybe not go to the Super Bowl, but they're going to be a very good team. They're going to win the division. If he doesn't, the Rams have problems. They're not using Gurley to the extent they did last year, and they're not going to use him that way probably ever again. I think they've used him well so far. Obviously, the first 2 weeks he's played well, but in a somewhat limited capacity. So that's one of the more interesting divisions. You look at Seattle. Seattle's my team, at least for now. But Seattle's my team. Russell Wilson. How a guy making $5 jillion a year gets no credit, I have no idea. But somehow he gets no credit. And of course, that Seattle team with Pete Carroll is always going to be defensive focused. And I happen to like their chances a lot. I can't wait till they come to the Coliseum. I'm going to be at that game here in LA. And then you got San Francisco. And we still don't know about Garoppolo. Is he a total system quarterback? Or is he going to be a guy who blossoms under Kyle Shanahan? Who's to say? I think that's a situation where if I'm buying and selling, if this was Wall Street, I think I would be buying Garoppolo right now. The way it looks, I know they're playing the Bengals. I understand. But I'd be holding Russell Wilson. I'm not so sure I wouldn't be selling or shorting the Rams, if you know anything about how stocks work on Wall Street. Could be wrong. I know this much. I'd be shorting the Steelers and I'd be buying the Browns. Everybody's way down on the Browns right now. We don't know about Freddie Kitchens. Can he coach? We're going to find out a hell of a lot more coming up later tonight with Monday Night Football. On Mondays here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred, we're talking pro football. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking college football. And holy mackerel, what a weekend of college football it was yesterday when it comes to some of the storylines. Not necessarily big games, big matchups, but there's always storylines. And every weekend, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to college football, is a big weekend. It just is. This is when we're finding out. This is when we're thinning the herd. We thinned the herd with South Carolina. Will Muschamp just can't coach. The Gamecocks coach. He's been at it for a while. Not happening for the Gamecocks. They're going to have to make a change because they had Alabama on the ropes. That game should have been down to the wire, and Muschamp flat out got out coached. And that's hard to do because Saban, to me, Nick Saban, not the greatest in-game coach in the world. I don't think he is. Just look at the national title game last year against Clemson. Nick Saban's a great recruiter, right? So as far as the Syracuse, I'm not going to get into college football. We're going to talk about that because if I start talking about college football, I'll keep talking about it. All right. We're on top of the NFL today, and we're going to visit with Robert Littell, and you can go ahead and give him a call, Cam, when you get a chance. Black Sports Online. We had a great conversation with him yesterday. I want to bring him in to talk about the Antonio Brown situation here momentarily because it's interesting that I'm looking at a tweet from Mike Freeman, who is an influential NFL writer. And I want to hear what Robert has to say about this and interested to hear what his thoughts are. I've seen some of his tweets. So when you get a chance, Cam, bring up Robert Littell. He's in Los Angeles here where I am as well. And someone who I think is as well-versed on this Antonio Brown situation as anybody. And Robert, I appreciate you visiting with us, man. Thanks for jumping on.
No problem at all.
Interested to see your comments about Antonio Brown. And it's amazing what we were talking about a couple of days ago when you were on the show. If people had been following your coverage, had been following what's been going on throughout that guy's career, and also in the context of other athletes similarly situated, you know, I don't think they'd be flying. I'm seeing people fly off the handle today.
Yeah, so when I first saw that the article was out, I honestly thought, like, okay, they must, SI's pretty good. They must have done some real investigation here. and
Right.
we got a smoking gun or audio or video, something that, we hadn't heard about. And, I give him credit for pulling out the one artist story that was new news. But then as I continued to read the story, my first thoughts was, I reported about this 6 months ago. I reported about this a year ago. I remember TMZ reporting about this. I'm like, there's no new information here. And then you have the one story about the artist, which, shows, if like you said, if you've been following people like myself and others, you already knew this was kind of a pattern with Antonio Brown of behavior where, obviously you never want to be uncomfortable. But that's not the first time that I've heard Antonio Brown is walking around naked in his house with multiple, women. That's not a new story, for me. Now, the question becomes, is this really something that you want to put out there in the context of this person is telling their story, which is perfectly fine. But when they, at the end, they say, well, I didn't think it ever rose to the point where I needed to go to the cops or where I needed to, I didn't feel that. I just felt like it was the guy that was flirting with me and I have to deal that with my job a lot. Basically saying that Antonio Brown is just one of the creeps that she has to deal with on a daily basis. So that's why I kind of disagree with people flying off the handle. I'm like, yeah, it's not a good look at all. And in the context of everything else that's going on with him, but I'm like, it's a very fine line, when you're using words like rape and sexual assault and things like that, we have to make sure that what the accusation is and what actually happened is the same thing. I mean, if you're saying someone is sexually assaulting you, and then on the flip side, say, hey, well, I didn't think it was enough to go to the cops. I think that should be presented in certain ways. So that's why I disagree with some people that say, oh, this is an automatic slam dunk. He's going to get suspended now.
Right.
The Steelers, the Raiders, they knew about all this other stuff with the baby mama drama and the lawsuits and him being a weirdo. If you've been following the right people, you have already known that.
Right. And here's the thing. If we're not pushing back on this, we're reporting inanimate, documented facts, and there are no criminal complaints to this extent. And the woman in the story, who's the artist, said or indicated that she never complained. She just left the next day. She never said anything. Did I miss something there?
No, I mean, she said that, he was flirting with her, that obviously maybe it was a sexual advance, but, she just kept doing her work. And I think maybe if you really want to look at it from a sense where, okay, if you really look at this, if Antonio Brown is truly, what a lot of people have been accusing him of, does he just walk away from that situation? The whole point is if you are someone that is being accused of sexual assault, you take, what you want. You don't just walk away, from the situation. Was this a situation where he, using some of the young people's terminology, he took a shot, he shooted a shot at the young lady. It didn't work. He's like, okay, I thought, if I had to paint my picture, she would like me. She doesn't like me. So now I'm on to the next woman. The woman herself says that he had multiple women in his house while she was there. So it's not like this was a situation where it was one-on-one, nobody else was there. And it seemed to me that they took something that doesn't look, I'm not saying in any way it looks good on Antonio Brown, but I don't consider it a smoking gun all of a sudden things are different than it was yesterday.
Well, here's the thing. If we say anything other than he should be suspended or placed on the exempt list and take away his career and his life, if we say anything other than that, we're defending him.
Right. Yeah.
Nobody's defending that.
No one.
That's the problem here.
Yeah, the totality of all the stuff that goes on with Antonio Brown, it gives you a picture that, this guy is a bit of a creep, is not a good person.
But wait a minute. I think the big point is, and you document it, that's why what you do is so valuable, is there's so many athletes out there. And I look at your feed and your website every single day, and it's chock full, maybe not as odd as him, but there are some guys that are as odd, but there's a lot of guys who are engaged in this behavior. And you've got to be wondering, Robert, you've got to just be blown away every day, because there's a lot of high profile, famous, popular athletes out there with the ladies, just in general, who are engaging in somewhat similar behavior. They shall remain nameless, but they're not nameless. They're on your website.
Right. That's why I was, I wasn't offended or mad at the SI report. I think some people maybe misconstrued that. What I was trying to say was it's very odd that in our industry, someone like myself at times could be called a hack or gossip page and all of that stuff until it becomes relevant to their stories. Now, all of a sudden, you want to know about the baby mamas. Now, all of a sudden, you want to know about the lawsuits. You want to know about the underbelly of what's going on, but not giving the people that initially did it, like myself, any credit. So it's the type of
swoop in.
Yeah. Now, when people say, "Oh, well, you're defending Antonio Brown," well, hey, I was the one that told you what was going on with his baby mama. I literally was just the one that said that we talked about, that him and Le'Veon Bell's baby mama was having communication. Like, I'm giving you that stuff consistently. And now all of a sudden everybody's shocked that this is happening. This is so shocking. I can't believe he has all baby mama drama and he doesn't pay child support. We do stories like that every single day. But here's the thing, when it's their favorite athlete or when it's an athlete that's not, something that's not as in the news, if it's someone they like, when they liked Antonio Brown, none of these stories matter. Now they don't like Antonio Brown, and he's a terrible person.
Right.
So I'm like, in Pittsburgh, we knew all of these stories was happening. They were reported publicly. A lot of this stuff is public information. But at that time, you liked Antonio Brown. He danced. He did all this. He caught touchdowns. Now, you don't like Antonio Brown, and all of a sudden you want him suspended. But you didn't want him suspended when he domestic violence calls and all of that. Right. We had all of that. And no one said, oh, this guy maybe has a problem. The Undefeated, the ESPN brand, they did a whole thing on Antonio Brown, and Antonio Brown threatened the writer.
Right.
And nobody said, well, put him on the exempt list.
And where's ESPN today about that story? Nowhere.
See, that's the thing. They won't roll it back. ESPN will roll out, lovely pieces about Ben Roethlisberger being hurt. But I still remember what Ben Roethlisberger did. To me, look at it like this. Let's say today, just randomly, because Ben Roethlisberger was hurt, I did a list of every bad thing that I've heard about Ben Roethlisberger over the last 10 years. Every assault, every whatever, all court cases, settlements. And I did it, and I said, man, that's a lot. When people say, man, consider what he did in the past, maybe we should suspend him. Of course not. And it's the hypocritical nature that really gets me.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating is you just brought up a point about ESPN had already documented much of this, right? But what are they going to do? This should actually be a verb, and the guy's a really good guy, but they Baxter Holmes did that past story. Yeah, we saw what happened when they were going to do an expose on Magic Johnson, and it could have been, my sources tell me, and this doesn't come from Baxter himself. We're talking about Baxter Holmes, an ESPN reporter who reported on the goings-on inside the Lakers front office and some of the malfeasance, you could call it, of Magic Johnson and his management of the Lakers. And when that story came out, I don't remember the exact timing of it. Baxter Holmes, ESPN reporter, puts this out on ESPN's website, and the same day, Stephen A. Smith and Michael Wilbon bring in Magic Johnson to absolutely immolate Baxter Holmes, and they don't give Baxter Holmes an opportunity to address what they said about him.
ESPN likes to play both sides of the coin. A lot of media likes to play both sides of the coin. That's what's so frustrating sometimes when you see me kind of talking on social media, because I have a good memory. I remember everything you said about Lamar Jackson. I remember every segment, everybody from Bleacher Report.
That's a whole show. What's been done to Lamar Jackson? They made him sound like I actually heard a sports radio host say he wasn't going to be a great quarterback because he had a speech impediment and he couldn't audible. Now, I've heard a million. I just saw a great interview that he did with Peter Schrager after the game yesterday, where he came off as a mucho leader. And but the way he was portrayed, this guy had no idea what a playbook was, and it was all just run the football. Now you look back at that game plan in the playoffs, how absurd does it look? The way nobody says anything to John Harbaugh about what were you doing in the playoffs with him last year?
Yeah, and then what happens is now that he's playing well, all of a sudden everybody loves him.
Amnesia.
He's the greatest thing. Yeah, they use you with how they need you. If the ratings mean, hey, let's talk bad about Lamar Jackson, then that's what they're going to do. Now that he's hot, we're going to act like we never said any of that stuff. I'm like, where's Mel Kiper now? Where's Bill Polian now? You know, what are these guys that you had, like you said, what Booger McFarland said, hey, if Louisville, cared about him, they should turn him into a wide receiver. So when the Ravens play on Monday Night Football, is he going to address that? Is he going to say that he's wrong? Is he going to apologize? Highly unlikely. So that's what gets me about media these days. And I try to inform people because people just listen to what they hear. And they hear it and they just take it as face value. And I'm like, no, you have to understand that they ride the narratives, whatever's best for them. They don't want to tell you the truth. They don't want to be consistent. They want to say whatever's going to say, that's going to make them, more ratings, more viewers and everything. And that's why I always kind of find myself in the middle of this, because I'm like, listen, I remember this is what these people have done. And you need to understand how these things are going on. From someone like you and me that's been in the media for a long period of time, we know.
Let me just tell you, I mean, that's a real inspiration to me to hear you say that, because I've thought a lot doing this show the last couple of days over the weekend. I wanted to spend some time. I'm going to in the future this week, talking about Lamar Jackson and how the guy has been wronged. He was just wronged. And what's funny to me is if you look at last year's playoff game in the second half, when they finally gave him a chance to throw the ball, people don't believe their eyes. He was unbelievable.
Yeah, it's crazy
at the end of that game.
Look, here's the thing, any rookie quarterback is going to have growing pains, and everybody's good at one thing. They have weaknesses. A great players always try to shore up their weaknesses. He knew, like, I got some accuracy issues and stuff like that. I'm going to work on it. But like you said, anybody that actually watched him play knew his dynamicness as someone that throws the football. Now, I see what the Ravens were trying to do. They're trying to, limit what he could do. But like you said, when you're in the playoffs, you've had 6-7 games. He had already had. You got to let him loose. And now, thankfully, with a full off season, no distractions, no Joe Flacco, they're letting him loose. They're letting him play. 37 passes, and he still has to run it. And I always say, no one ever criticized Josh Allen for running. No one. He has more like rushing touchdowns, I believe, in the last 8 games or so than almost any running back in the NFL. But nobody ever. They say he's using his abilities to help lead the team. He's a leader. He's doing everything that he needs to do to lead. No one ever says that. White quarterbacks are scramblers. I never heard anybody describe Steve Young as a runner. Right. It's
dual threat.
These stereotypes that are still there that I think, I always take, pride in my job to try to alert people to them and then try to break them down. Like, hey, it's not about me liking Lamar Jackson more than Josh Allen. It's about you treating Lamar Jackson exactly the same as you would treat Josh Allen. That's what I'm looking for.
So I want to wrap up with Antonio Brown, and I want to give you my prediction on what I think is going to happen, and a quick comment. I want to get your thought on it, or just your thoughts on what's going to happen. But with Antonio Brown, I personally believe absolutely nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen to Antonio Brown. There's no criminal complaint here. He looks like a weird guy, kind of a douche or whatever, as Paul Zeiss for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called him. Sure, absolutely. But nothing's going to happen. And no one, and everybody in the Boston media today, and a lot of the national media, screaming right now, get rid of him, get rid of him, get rid of him, knowing full well their team's not going to get rid of him. And nobody, and I mean, if you're so unhappy, if you're so upset, why don't you go to Patriots Place and voice that discontent? But they're not going to confront the Patriots. And Tom Brady is going to continue to force the ball into Antonio Brown and get him involved in the offense because they want to win a Super Bowl. And ultimately, everybody's going to scream about it, but nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I think, like you said, unless there's an actual criminal complaint, I think that's the thing. In the whole thing in the SI article, if that's one thing that's going to save him, is he can literally walk in there and says, listen, this woman says all these things about me, but she never felt the need to, she never felt it raised to the level. Like, unfortunately, like you said, creep, absolutely. But if someone was in my house, and I'm walking around in a towel, That's not a criminal offense. It's weird.
And you don't say anything. And you don't
it.
say anything to me. For all you know,
Yeah.
this is a consensual situation.
Yeah, and I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, did he touch her inappropriately?
And by the way, that's awful. That's terrible. To an extent.
Yeah.
No one's saying that. We're not defending him. We're just pointing this out.
It's not criminal. It's just, and if they put every NFL player on the exempt list who was a little bit creepy around women, the list would be very, very long. If they just went through the BSO archives,
I was just going to say that,
and find those stories, a good percentage of the NFL players would be on the exempt list, and I just leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Robert, man. I appreciate you jumping on short notice. This has been great.
No problem at all. Anytime. Thanks.
That's Robert Littal of blacksportsonline.com. You can follow him on BSO on Twitter. Man, we covered everything. NFL-wise, Antonio Brown, the rules situation, some of the intriguing stories, some of the national perspective from Twitter. We had it all. And tomorrow we're going to focus, depends on what happens. If we get crazy stories in NFL, whatever, we'll figure it out. But we'll focus a little bit on college football. Spend a little more time on that. Maybe spend some time on your team here on Fancred. We've got the fan line. I'd love to get you involved. I'd love to get you, and we're going to do that. We're going to have time for people and their comments and all that stuff. So we got a lot going on here with big-time guests, all the relevant hot topics and subjects. And so just keep on coming back. We're going to do this every single day from noon to 2 Eastern time. So from Los Angeles, I'm Brooks Melchior, and this has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.